Hello, lovely. Settle in, your story is waiting.
The moment changed everything. Elara was carrying a tray of fine china through the corridor she'd been explicitly told never to enter. A staff error had sent her there, a maid's confusion about which wing needed tea service. She should have turned back immediately. Instead, she'd hurried forward, trying to correct the mistake before anyone noticed. She rounded the corner just as the door to the sealed-off west wing opened. The collision was violent and inevitable. The tray flew from her hands. Porcelain shattered across the stone floor. A catastrophic, expensive sound. Elara stumbled backward, her foot finding glass, her body falling toward the jagged shards. And then his hand caught hers. It was instinct, pure and immediate. A man seeing a woman about to fall, reaching to save her. His fingers clasped her hand firmly, his other hand bracing her wrist, stopping her descent with surprising strength. For a moment, they were suspended in that contact, his hand warm, steady, almost burning against hers. The touch sent a shock through him that had nothing to do with physical attraction. It was something else, something ancient, something that felt like the fulfillment of a prophecy he'd spent 2 years convinced would never happen. Elara looked up at him, seeing for the first time the face of the man she'd only heard whispered about by the servants, the Viscount, Julian Ashford, the nobleman who'd sealed himself away in this wing, who'd cut himself off from the world after his father's catastrophic ruin had nearly destroyed everything. He was beautiful, devastatingly beautiful, but more than that, he looked shattered, as though her touch had broken something inside him that had been carefully contained. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have been here. I didn't mean—" He released her hand as though it had burned him. He stepped backward, his face going pale, his eyes wild with something that looked like terror. "Go," he said, his voice rough. "Leave this wing. Don't return." She left. She had to. But the touch lingered, not on her skin, but in her mind, in her heart, in some inexplicable way that she couldn't name or understand. What Elara didn't know was that in that moment, Julian had just fulfilled a dying prophecy, and his entire world had shifted on its axis. Stay until the end. Because this story will show you what happens when a grandmother's dying curse becomes the only thing standing between a family and complete ruin, and how a maid's innocent touch can change the fate of a nobleman forever. Where are you listening from? I'd love to know. But to understand why that touch mattered so much, why one moment of contact could shake a man to his very core, we have to go back. 2 years before Elara touched his hand, Julian Ashford had sealed the gates of Ashworth Court. Not the main gates. Those remained functional for servants and necessary business. But the symbolic gates of his life, the entrances to his heart, the possibility of connection. He'd closed it all away with the same decisive finality that a man might close the door on a burning room. Ashworth Court itself was a monument to decay. The magnificent Georgian estate sprawled across the Derbyshire landscape like a sleeping giant, beautiful in its bones, but rotting from within. The financial ruin his father had created hadn't been a quick collapse. It had been a slow, deliberate unravelling. Bad investments, catastrophic gambling debts, the systematic squandering of centuries of accumulated wealth. By the time Julian had inherited the title at 26, the estate was hemorrhaging money. The land itself was worth something, but the debts were astronomical. The family name, once respected throughout Derbyshire and into London's highest circles, had become synonymous with financial irresponsibility and moral failure. Julian had responded to this inheritance the only way he knew how. He'd withdrawn from the world entirely. He'd sealed off the east and south wings of the manor, reducing the household staff to a skeleton crew. He'd cut his personal expenses to almost nothing. He'd thrown himself into understanding the estate's operations, studying accounts, meeting with solicitors, attempting to calculate whether salvation was even possible. The answer was grim. Probably not. But he would spend his life trying. His grandmother had been different. The Dowager Countess had been a legend in her own right. A woman of formidable intellect and political acumen, someone who'd wielded influence through intelligence rather than wealth. She'd watched Julian's withdrawal with the eye of someone who understood the cost of despair. 2 years ago, on her deathbed, she'd called him to her chambers. She'd been frail by then, her voice thin as paper, but her mind remained sharp. "You're killing yourself," she'd said, without preamble. Slowly, deliberately, with every day you spend sealed away in that wing. I'm doing what needs to be done, Julian had replied. Protecting what's left of the family name. You're protecting nothing, the dowager had said. You're simply preparing for ruin by ensuring that when it comes, you've already abandoned everything worth saving. She'd taken his hand then, this grandmother he'd always respected but never quite understood. Listen to me carefully, she'd continued, her grip surprisingly strong. Only a touch of true innocence can lift the weight from Ashworth. You must marry the first hand you hold after you've sealed the gates. Fail, and the debt will swallow the house, and the name will perish in madness. Julian had assumed she was delirious. The fever was affecting her mind, but the dowager had squeezed his hand with what felt like absolute certainty. I'm not speaking in riddles, she'd said. I'm speaking in truth. You've sealed the gates of your heart, but there is innocence in this world that can unseal them. Find it, marry it, and save us all. She died 3 days later, and Julian, despite his rational mind's rebellion against the statement, had found himself unable to dismiss her words. They'd burrowed into him like a seed, taking root, growing. He'd spent 2 years interpreting them not as mystical prophecy, but as a psychological and moral imperative, perhaps the only thing that might snap him out of the slow suicide of his isolation, perhaps the only thing that might give him a reason to live beyond mere survival. Then, 6 months ago, the financial crisis had reached a breaking point. The debts could no longer be managed through careful economies. Julian had needed capital, significant capital, and the only way to secure it had been through marriage. He'd allowed his solicitors to approach Mr. Blackwood, the powerful financier whose daughter, Cordelia, was beautiful, ambitious, and entirely indifferent to Julian as a person. The betrothal had been purely transactional, her money for his title. Neither of them had pretended it was anything more. But the engagement had felt like a surrender, a capitulation to the same forces that had destroyed his father. He was selling himself, trading the last of his dignity for the survival of a name that might not deserve to survive. And then Elara had rounded the corner. Julian had not slept that night. He'd returned to his chambers after sending Elara away, and he'd sat in the darkness, his hands still tingling from the contact, his mind spinning with implications he couldn't fully grasp. The grandmother's words, which had seemed theoretical, abstract, almost ridiculous, had suddenly become concrete. He had sealed the gates, metaphorically, practically, in every way that mattered, and he had held the first hand that had touched him after that sealing. A maid, a scullery worker, a girl with dirt beneath her fingernails and fear in her eyes. The prediction had been fulfilled. What did that mean? It meant, according to his grandmother's final instruction, that this woman, this impossible ordinary maid, was somehow the key to his salvation, the touch of true innocence that could lift the weight from Ashworth. Or it meant he was losing his mind, interpreting coincidence as prophecy, desperately seeking meaning in an arbitrary encounter because his grandmother's words had planted seeds of hope in soil that should have been barren. Julian had spent the night wrestling with both possibilities. By dawn, he'd reached a decision that felt like both cowardice and courage simultaneously. He would honor the prediction. Not because he believed in it literally, but because he'd been given an instruction by someone he respected, and he'd already fulfilled half of it. He couldn't know what his grandmother had told him. He couldn't unsee the moment when the maid had rounded the corner and become, by her own hand and his, the fulfillment of a prophecy. To ignore it would be to live with the conviction that he'd doomed his family through his own cowardice. He would find her. He would offer her the contract that his grandmother's words had seemingly demanded. And perhaps, just perhaps, something in the act of honoring the prediction would break the cycle of failure that had defined his family's recent history. He'd sent for her the following morning. When Elara arrived at his study, she was terrified. She'd been certain she was being dismissed, fired for her transgression of entering the forbidden wing. She stood in the doorway, her hands trembling, her eyes downcast. Julian had looked at her and tried to see what his grandmother had seen. Innocence. True innocence. What did that even mean? She was young, perhaps 22 or 23. Her dress was the drab grey of a servant's work. Her hands were rough from labour, but her face, when she finally looked up at him, held something that might have been innocence, a clear, unguarded quality, as though she hadn't yet learned how to hide her emotions or weaponize her beauty. Sit, he'd said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Elara had sat, her entire body rigid with fear. "I'm not dismissing you," Julian had begun. "Quite the opposite. I'm offering you something that will seem, at first, impossible. And then, when you understand the details, it's likely reprehensible. But I'm asking you to listen before you refuse." He'd laid it out plainly. The financial ruin, the crushing debts, the family history of failure. He'd explained about his engagement to Cordelia Blackwood and why he was breaking it. And then, and this was the part that had cost him the most, he'd told her about his grandmother's prediction. "I don't ask you to believe in prophecies or curses," he'd said carefully, "but I ask you to believe that I have made a decision based on what I believe to be true. When you touched my hand yesterday, something shifted in me. My grandmother's final instruction was that I marry the first hand I hold after sealing myself away. You are that hand." Elara had stared at him as though he'd spoken in tongues. "I'm offering you a contract," Julian had continued. "Marriage to a Viscount, the title of Countess, a secure home for your grandmother, Ada, whose cottage is under threat of foreclosure, freedom from poverty, everything you'll need to live with dignity and security. And what do you want in return?" Elara had asked, her voice small. This was the cruelest part, the part that made him feel like a monster. "A marriage in name only," he'd said quietly. "I cannot, will not, break the vow of that touch again. Our marriage will be legal, publicly recognized, but privately, we will live in complete separation. You will have your own chambers, your own life. No one will know the truth but us. We will live eternally apart, even as we are publicly bound." Elara had been silent for a long time. "Why would you offer this?" she'd finally asked. "Why not simply marry the Blackwood girl and be done with it?" "Because," Julian had said, and the words had felt like the truest thing he'd ever spoken, "I cannot live with the conviction that I've ignored a final instruction from someone I respected, and because some part of me believes, or needs to believe, that your innocence might be the thing that saves us all." Elara had looked at him with eyes full of something he couldn't identify. Pity, perhaps, or understanding, or the beginning of love for a man so broken that he would marry a stranger based on a prophecy. "I accept," she'd said. The wedding had taken place quietly, with only a handful of witnesses and no fanfare. Julian had married Elara in the small chapel on the estate ground, with her grandmother Ada sitting in the front pew, her hand clasped over her mouth in stunned gratitude. The maid had become a countess in a ceremony that lasted 20 minutes. Afterward, Julian had taken her to the East Wing, the sealed-off portion of the manor that he'd claimed as his own. He'd shown her to a suite of chambers that had been hastily prepared for a wife he'd married out of duty to a prophecy. "These are your rooms," he'd said, his voice formal and distant. "Your lady's maid, Margaret, will attend you. Anything you need, you're to ask her. You will not require my permission for anything relating to your own comfort or your grandmother's care." "And you?" Elara had asked. "Where will you be?" "In the adjoining chambers," he'd replied. "There is a connecting door, but it will remain locked. I will not cross that threshold. You have my word on that, as binding as any marriage vow." He'd turned to leave, but she'd stopped him with a single word. "Why?" she'd asked. Julian had paused at the door. "Because I cannot afford to want something I've sworn not to take," he'd said quietly. "And being near you, being close enough to touch, would test that vow in ways I'm not strong enough to withstand." He'd left her alone in those rooms, surrounded by luxury and isolation, married to a man she barely knew, bound by a vow that had never been explained to her satisfaction. Elara had spent that first night alone, her hand pressed against the locked door that separated her from her husband's chambers, trying to understand how she'd arrived at this impossible place. She'd been a scullery maid that morning. By evening, she was a countess. Her grandmother was safe. The foreclosure on Ada's cottage was lifted. She had security that she'd never dared to hope for, but she was married to a man who wouldn't touch her, wouldn't speak to her, wouldn't even acknowledge her existence except when absolutely necessary for public appearance. It was, she'd thought in the darkness, both salvation and prison. Over the following weeks, Elara had begun to understand the shape of her new life. She had servants. She had money to purchase whatever she wanted. She had Margaret, the lady's maid, who was kind and helpful and never asked questions about the strange arrangement. She had her grandmother, healthy and safe and finally at peace. But she saw Julian only in passing. He would nod to her in the halls. He would speak to her formally at meals when the servants could see them. but he maintained perfect, agonizing distance. The estate, however, had begun to transform around her. Julian worked constantly, not on his own comfort, but on the restoration of the manor and the improvement of the tenants' lives. He walked the grounds, spoke with the farmers, reviewed accounts, and slowly, despite his isolation from her, Elara began to understand him. She began to see a man carrying a weight that should have crushed him. A man who'd convinced himself that salvation could come only from outside, from prophecy, or magic, or the touch of innocent hands. A man so damaged by his father's failures that he'd sealed himself away completely, believing that isolation was the price of honor. And she fell in love with him, not the romantic love of passion, but the deeper love that comes from witnessing someone's pain and understanding that you cannot fix it, but you can stand beside it. The letter had arrived 3 weeks after the wedding. It was from Mr. Blackwood, and it was a threat written in the careful language of a man who wielded power and expected obedience. He knew about the marriage to the maid, he knew about the broken engagement, and he was prepared to expose both, to publicly reveal Julian's debts, his financial desperation, and the scandal of his marriage to a servant. The scandal would ruin him, not just socially, but financially. Blackwood's influence was extensive enough to ensure that no respectable lender would touch the Ashworth name. The estate would be seized. The title would be rendered meaningless. Julian had read the letter twice, and then he'd done something that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd laughed. It was a terrible laugh, bordering on hysterical, but it was also, somehow, liberating. Let him, he'd said to his solicitor. Let him expose everything. I've spent 2 years convinced that my only salvation would come from outside, from prophecy or magic. I've been wrong. I'm going to stop hiding. He'd made a decision. Instead of retreating further, he would advance. He would hold the winter solstice ball, a grand event that hadn't been held at Ashworth Court in over a decade. He would introduce Elara to society not as a secret shame, but as the Countess, and he would force society to accept what he'd chosen. It was an act of absolute defiance. The preparations had been frantic. The manor had been restored to its full magnificence. Servants had been brought in from the village to help with cleaning and restoration. Invitations had been sent to every family of note in Derbyshire and into Yorkshire and Lancashire. And Elara had been transformed. Margaret had done the work, bringing in a lady's companion, a woman named Mrs. Ashby, who taught etiquette, language, deportment. Elara had learned which fork to use, how to address a duchess, how to move through a ballroom with grace. But the transformation had gone deeper than that. She'd learned about the estate. Julian had begun to allow her into his study, not for intimacy, but for business. He'd shown her the accounts, explained the strategies for salvaging Ashworth, and Elara, who'd spent her life watching and listening, had proven to have a sharp mind for economics. She'd begun to make suggestions, and Julian had begun to listen. They'd fallen into a rhythm during those weeks of preparation. Morning meetings where they discussed the estate, afternoons where they worked separately, but in proximity, evenings where they maintained their distance, but no longer out of fear, out of respect for a vow that was becoming increasingly difficult to keep, because Julian was falling in love with her. He could feel it happening and was powerless to stop it. Every conversation revealed new depths to her intelligence. Every glimpse of her moving through the manor reminded him of what he'd promised not to do. He was tormented by his own vow, the promise he'd made not to break the touch again. One night, unable to sleep, he'd gone to the library and found her there, reading by candlelight. They'd talked for hours about books, about philosophy, about the nature of prophecy, and whether his grandmother had truly foreseen something or simply understood human nature well enough to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. "Do you ever regret it?" he'd asked near dawn. "Marrying me, accepting a life of separation?" "Every day," she'd said simply, "and never." He'd almost reached for her then, almost broke the vow. But instead, he'd left her there with her books and returned to his chambers, his body aching with the effort of maintaining distance from someone he'd bound himself to legally, but not emotionally. The night of the ball, when he'd finally seen her in the dress Mrs. Ashby had commissioned, a gown of deep emerald silk that made her look like a forest sprite, like something wild and genuine and utterly beyond his reach. He'd nearly undone 3 months of restraint, but he'd held firm, for the vow, for the prophecy, for the belief that some things, once promised, could not be broken without destroying everything. The winter solstice ball had been set for the 21st of December. It was, in many ways, an act of defiance against everything Julian's isolation had represented. The manor had been decorated with winter branches and white flowers. The ballroom had been lit with hundreds of candles. The kitchens had been working for weeks to prepare food worthy of the occasion. Society had been scandalized by the invitation, but they'd accepted anyway. A ball at Ashworth Court after a decade of darkness. Everyone wanted to see what Julian had done. Everyone wanted to witness whether the man who'd sealed himself away would destroy himself publicly through this marriage to a servant. Elara had spent the days before the ball in a state of quiet terror. She understood what was at stake. She understood that Julian was risking everything: his reputation, his financial situation, his carefully maintained distance from the world, on the gamble that society would accept her, that she could move through the ballroom with enough grace to be mistaken for someone of breeding rather than service. Margaret had continued to coach her, but late one afternoon, Elara had asked to see Julian. She'd been shown to his study, where he was reviewing final preparations with his solicitor. He'd dismissed the man immediately when she entered. "Are you certain about this?" she'd asked without preamble. "The ball, the exposure, introducing me to society as if I was born to this instead of servitude." Julian had looked at her across his desk, and she'd seen something in his expression shift. "No," he'd said honestly, "but I've spent 2 years being certain about nothing but isolation. It's time I tried certainty in the other direction." "Mr. Blackwood will be there," she'd said. "He'll try to expose you, to expose us." "I know," Julian had replied, "and I'm prepared for that." There had been a moment where he'd looked at her with such intensity that she'd thought he might break the vow. His hand had moved slightly toward hers, but then he'd stopped, catching himself, returning to the careful distance that had defined their marriage. "You've changed everything," he'd said quietly, "not because of a prophecy or because you touched my hand in that corridor, but because you've shown me that isolation was never honor. It was cowardice, and you've had the courage to stand beside me while I unlearn that cowardice." "Julian," she'd started, but he'd cut her off gently. "Don't," he'd said. "Not yet. Let me honor the vow a little longer. But know that I'm not keeping my distance anymore because I believe I must. I'm keeping it because I promised. And I will break that promise, Elara. Just not tonight." The night of the ball had arrived grey and cold, snow beginning to fall over the Derbyshire hills. Elara had dressed in the emerald gown, her hair arranged with white flowers, her appearance transformed into something that looked genuinely aristocratic. When she'd descended the grand staircase, Julian had been waiting in the entrance hall. He'd looked at her as though she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And then he'd offered her his arm, and together they'd walked into the ballroom, where all of Derbyshire society was waiting to judge them. The moment Elara entered the ballroom on Julian's arm, the room fell silent, not with welcome, but with shock. The whispers started immediately, audible enough for her to hear, deliberate enough that she was meant to. The servant's maid, the scullery worker, dressed as a countess, moving through the ballroom like she belonged there, but she did belong there. And Julian's presence, his absolute certainty, his refusal to apologize or retreat, made it clear that he believed she did. He introduced her to families. He danced with her first, the traditional opening dance, his hand firm at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. He spoke to her with the courtesy and attention he might have shown a duchess, making clear through every gesture and word that she was valued. Elara had been trained for this by Margaret, but the training fell away when Julian held her. She moved as though they'd been dancing together for years, as though their bodies understood each other in a way their formal arrangement should have precluded. When the dance ended, he led her to the side of the ballroom, but not before half of Derbyshire had seen them together, seen the way he looked at her, seen the way she looked at him. The evening progressed in a strange duality. On the surface, it was a triumph. Families approached her with careful courtesy. Young women included her in conversations. The initial shock of her presence had transformed into grudging acceptance, but beneath the surface, the scandal simmered. Elara heard the whispers, saw the cold glances from some of the older women, felt the weight of judgment that hadn't been entirely lifted by Julian's confident presentation of her. And then, near midnight, Mr. Blackwood had arrived. He was everything Julian had warned her about, a man of considerable wealth and considerable cruelty, someone who wielded power through manipulation and threat. He'd made directly for Julian, his expression set with the grim satisfaction of someone about to deliver a killing blow. Elara had watched from across the ballroom as Blackwood had cornered Julian near the library entrance. She'd seen Julian's face remain composed while Blackwood spoke, low, intense, clearly threatening. She'd seen the moment when Blackwood had gestured toward her, making his intentions clear. He was about to expose everything, the debts, the marriage to the servant, the broken engagement. He was about to destroy Julian publicly, and something in Elara had broken open. She'd excused herself from the conversation she was having and had walked directly toward them. It was a breach of etiquette, a young woman inserting herself into a conversation with men. But she'd been beyond caring about propriety. "Mr. Blackwood," she'd said, her voice steady and clear, "I believe you were about to speak to my husband regarding our estate's finances." Blackwood had looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting her to be bold enough to address him directly. "I was," he'd said, his smile cold. "Perhaps it would be better if we continued this conversation in the library, where matters of finance can be discussed without the delicate sensibilities of society being offended." "No," Elara had said. "I think matters of finance should be discussed frankly, wherever they occur. I've recently become quite involved in the estate management, and I believe there are several points that should be clarified regarding your claims about Mr. Ashford's financial situation." Blackwood had looked startled. Clearly he'd expected her to be decorative, not knowledgeable. "You're a servant," he'd said coldly. "You cannot possibly understand the complexities of these financial matters." "I was a servant," Elara had corrected. "Now I'm the Countess of Ashworth, and I've spent the last 3 months learning the complexities of our financial situation with considerably more honesty than your threatened exposé seems to promise. I understand that you believe you have leverage over my husband. I'm suggesting that you've misunderstood the situation entirely." She'd pulled from her reticule a small sheaf of papers, copies of documents that Julian had showed her, financial figures that demonstrated his progress towards salvaging the estate, evidence of legitimate investment and careful stewardship. "The Ashworth estates are not in the state of catastrophic ruin you seem to believe," she continued. "And my husband's marriage to me is not a scandal, but a deliberate choice, a choice that has brought stability rather than shame." She'd handed the papers to Blackwood, and she'd seen the moment when he'd understood that his leverage was gone. The threats he'd prepared to deliver were meaningless if his secrets were already known and addressed. "I suggest you enjoy the ball, Mr. Blackwood," she'd said coldly, "and I suggest you never threaten my husband's reputation again." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding, uncertain whether she'd saved Julian or destroyed them both. Julian had watched the entire exchange from across the room. He'd seen Blackwood's face shift from confidence to shock, to furious realization that his ammunition had been rendered useless. He'd seen Elara stand before one of the most powerful men in England and defend him with a courage and grace that had taken his breath away. And he'd understood, in that moment, what his grandmother had truly meant. The curse, the prophecy. It had never been about magic. It had never been about the supernatural intervention of a dying woman's final words. It had been about the simple, profound truth that isolation could only be broken by someone willing to step into the light. Elara had touched his hand in that corridor not because fate had ordained it, but because she'd accidentally entered the sealed-off wing. And in that moment of collision, Julian had been forced to make a choice: remain sealed away, or allow himself to be touched by someone genuine, someone innocent of the games that society played. He'd chosen wrong at first. He'd thought the cure was the vow of distance, the marriage in name only, the preservation of some romantic principle about honor and restraint. But watching her stand before Mr. Blackwood, watching her defend not just him, but herself, her right to be a countess, her right to be valued, he'd understood that the real curse had never been his family's debt or his father's ruin. The real curse had been his fear, his emotional paralysis, his belief that salvation had to come from outside because he wasn't capable of choosing it for himself. Elara had taught him otherwise. He'd excused himself from his conversation and had walked directly to her, taking her hand in front of half of Derbyshire society, a deliberate breaking of the vow he'd maintained so carefully for months. The room had fallen silent. "Come with me," he'd said simply. He'd led her away from the ballroom, away from the whispers and judgment, to the library, where moonlight streamed through the tall windows. He'd closed the door behind them and for the first time in their marriage, they'd been truly alone. "You broke every rule of proper conduct," he'd said, but he was smiling. "I did," she'd agreed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have inserted myself." "Don't apologize," he'd interrupt. "Ever. What you did was brave and brilliant and entirely necessary, and it made me understand something my grandmother spent the last months of her life trying to teach me." He'd taken both her hands in his. "The curse was never the prophecy," he'd said quietly. "The curse was my isolation, my belief that I had to earn salvation through deprivation and distance, my certainty that I wasn't worthy of happiness because my father had destroyed everything." Tears had filled Elara's eyes. "The salvation came when you touched my hand in that corridor," he'd continued. "Not because of fate or magic, but because you were real, genuine, innocent of the pretense and games that everyone else in my life had been playing. And you refused to let me hide from that reality." "Julian," she'd whispered. "I'm breaking the vow," he'd said. "I'm breaking it deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of what I'm choosing. I'm choosing you, not because a prophecy demands it, but because I love you. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the courage you've shown in standing beside me." He'd reached for her then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Elara had stepped toward him instead, and when he'd finally held her, it had felt like the sealing of something far more real than any formal vow. They'd kissed as moonlight filled the library, and the shadow of Ashworth had begun, finally, to lift. The ball had continued without them. By morning, all of Derbyshire was whispering about how the Viscount and Countess had disappeared into the library together, a breach of propriety so complete that it should have destroyed her reputation entirely. Instead, something unexpected had happened. Society had decided to be romantic about it. The Viscount had fallen in love with his wife. The servant girl had become a countess and had proven herself worthy of the position. It was, in its own way, the fairy tale that everyone had wanted to believe. The marriage, which had been in name only, became real in every way that mattered. Julian had moved into Elara's chambers, and she into his. They'd begun their life together, not as two people bound by prophecy or obligation, but as two people who'd chosen each other deliberately, fully, without reservation. The estate had been saved, not through Blackwood's money, but through Elara's insights into efficient management and Julian's willingness to listen. Within a year, the most pressing debts had been paid. Within 2 years, Ashworth Court was not just solvent, but prosperous. But more importantly, Julian had been saved. He'd emerged from his self-imposed isolation and had become once again a part of society. He'd hosted gatherings and attended social functions. He'd become involved in local governance and had used his newfound stability to support the tenants and the village that depended on the estate. And it was all because of Elara. She'd never fully adopted the manner of aristocracy. She'd maintained something genuine in her bearing, something that spoke of her origins, but society had come to see that as her greatest strength. She was different, yes, but different was what Ashworth had needed. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Julian had taken Elara to the chapel where they'd been married. "Do you remember what you were the day I met you?" he'd asked. "A scullery maid," she'd replied. "And what are you now?" "I'm still myself," she'd said, "just with a better dress and a man I love beside me." Julian had smiled and had taken her hand, the same gesture he'd refused to repeat for so many months. "My grandmother was never really about prophecy or curse," he'd said. "She was about teaching me that the weight of Ashworth couldn't be lifted by isolation or suffering. It could only be lifted by connection, by allowing someone to touch you, truly touch you, and not pull away." They'd walked the grounds of Ashworth Court together, their hands intertwined, and the shadow that had once hung over the place had finally, completely been lifted. The estate would prosper, the name would continue. But more importantly, the man who carried the name would finally know what it meant to be happy. All because a maid had rounded a corner and touched his hand. All because a grandmother, in her wisdom, had understood that sometimes the only cure for a broken heart is the courage to let someone else mend it.